Okay, today we are going to talk about installing an identity before you've actually earned it. So here's a quick question. You did April, you found the old story, you kind of identified the inherited voices, right, that were running in your source document, and you wrote the reframe. You might have even wrote the sequel, and that's good, but now what? Because here's the thing no one tells you about rewriting the story. The rewrite is not the arrival, it's actually the blueprint. And having a blueprint is not the same as living in the building. So, a lot of people, do deep, honest, meaningful reinvention work and they end up frustrated because they've done all the work and they feel genuinely different and they look at their actual life, their actual decisions, their actual conversations, how they actually introduce themselves to someone, and they realize that nothing's changed. The story's different, but the behavior is identical. So, welcome to The Gap.
You're listening to Too Late My Ass, the podcast that exists because someone had to say it out loud. I'm Faye Chappell, and this show is for anyone who's been quietly wondering if they missed their window. Spoiler, you didn't. Your brain is still neuroplastic, your identity is still negotiable, and your second act, it's not a consolation prize, it's the whole damn point. Let's get into it.
This is May. It means we're going to do an identity upgrade. This month, we're going to close the gap. So today, why knowing who you want to be or become is about 20% of the job. We know that, right? The neuroscience of what actually installs that new identity, not the Instagram version, the real version, the future self protocol, that's what we're going to talk about today, and why really acting like the future self before you feel like it is not fake. It's actually just a mechanism. So let's go. Let's talk about that gap and why it exists. We've talked about this before. We're ingraining this in because, again, we did the April work to break it down, and now we got to go to May and make sure we drill it in because most identity change models are missing a step, and it's a crucial one. You do the inner work, you get the insight, you change the behavior, right? It's linear, it's clean, it makes sense. But here's what actually happens you do that inner work. You get the insight, you feel genuinely different. And then the brain, which has been running its current operating system for the last 30 or 40 years, it looks at that new insight and goes, interesting. And then it runs the old operating system again, right? Because the old one is familiar, it's efficient, it's practice, it requires no effort. The new one is really theoretical. The brain is not being difficult, it's being sensible. Those new pathways are kind of expensive to build, and the brain doesn't want to build them just because it might be a good idea. It builds them on the basis of evidence. We've talked about this so much in the last couple of weeks, right? Repeated behavior over time with kind of an emotional engagement. That's what makes it stick. And this is why people can be intellectually really committed to a new identity for years and years and years and still not really inhabit it, right? Because the intellectual commitment lives like just in their brain, but the behavior lives in doing it, right? These are different systems. The first one doesn't automatically update the second one. But here's the good news. The second system can be updated. We've been working on that, right? The update just requires a different approach, really a different approach than let's think about this harder. So, here's what the approach actually is. And it's going to sound a little strange at first. We're repeating a lot of lessons to make sure that it's working for you, okay? So, because it might be a little uncomfortable, maybe a little too close to fake it till you make it. And I know a lot of you find that kind of infuriating, right? But stick with me because the science here is specific and it changes everything. The approach is act like the future self before you feel like the future self, right? Not perform, not pretend, act. Make decisions that the future self would make. Have conversations that the future self would. Introduce yourself the way the future self would. I want you to take up space that the future self occupies. And I want you to do this consistently over time. And then the brain, it'll start tracking this behavior, this evidence, right? And it'll begin to update. We talked about this concept a lot in April, and it was so that you would understand and get a little feel for how to actually make it work and put it in. So even though I told you last month a couple of times to start doing little bits and pieces, we hadn't fully torn down our old structure. But now that we have torn it down, we can move and fluidly move into what we want to do. The process kind of has a name. It's called behavioral activation of identity. That's where the smart people say. Because the research goes back decades. And coincidentally, that mechanism behind why role playing is used in clinical settings for everything from like anxiety training to leadership development, that behavior doesn't follow the identity. The identity follows the behavior. Think about that. How many of you have always hated role playing? Oh, I was in sales most of my life. And when I first started, we had to do role play, role play, role play. And I hated it and I didn't understand it. But then what you realize is when you role play, it sets it into your brain so you become the person you're role playing. So role playing is actually really, really great. Doesn't mean I like it anymore, but it does work. So here's the interesting part. Let me give you kind of three mechanisms because understanding it is going to really help you do it. So think about first, let's think a little bit about your memory and your mental stimulation, right? Because your brain has a remarkable capacity to simulate future events, right? It does. So not just really imagine them, but actually run them. It engages that same network that would fire if the event was actually happening. You've heard a lot of a skilled athlete, they visualize their performance in detail, right? And it fires these patterns similar to the actual execution. So when a person imagines a future scenario, that brain processes it in kind of like overlapping circuitry, right? So it feels like it's the real experience. And it's not magic, it's prediction machinery, right? The brain is constantly running simulations of likely futures that are going to happen. So it's preparing you to navigate them, right? The future self-visualization, it works by feeding that machinery specific, emotionally rich representation of a particular future version of you, and it lets the machinery run. So now you're really starting to understand how that whole visualization really works. The specificity is everything. So if you say, I want to be more successful, it gives the machine nothing to work with, right? Because you haven't told it anything. If you say, I am the person who walks into the pitch meeting and describes the work without the credential reach, who charges X rate without being apologetic, who introduces herself as someone who really knows what they're doing, not who they're used to be, then that machine can run. And running it enough time actually changes it and informs your brain that this is your automatic behavior. So that really, you can understand now how role playing and visualization really helps you move forward in that new identity. So number two, there's also this prediction error that we talked about, right? And it's we talked about this in the story rewrite context last month. You might have remembered. If you didn't listen to that, you should go back because the brain updates their self-concept through this prediction error. And that's that gap that we talked about at the top, right? The gap between what is expected and what actually happened. So when you act like your future self in a real situation and it goes better than the old story predicted it would, when the room doesn't collapse, when the direct path lands, when the rates hold, then the brain notices that. and something unexpected happens. The old model isn't quite accurate. And so the update's required, and the brain does it. So you can't really lose. So this is why that 7-day future self activation challenge that we're running this month is it's in the inner circle. It's structured around actual behavior experiments rather than internal exercises, right? So you can visualize all day, but until you take that future self into a real room and see what happens, that prediction error doesn't get generated. So without that error, the update doesn't land quite as good. So let's say that again, right? So we're doing kind of in easier terms, we're doing a role play in our brain, right? And then when we actually go into the real version and it becomes better than our role play, we get a cool update that says, yeah, this is the new me, right? And then finally, there's a third, which is kind of a narrative identity, I guess, really. And the self, it wants to be coherent, right? This is a deep feature of the human psyche, and it's not a flaw. It's when your internal narrative says, I am X, and your behavior says, I am Y. The system's like, what the hell is happening here, right? And it resolves that tension by pulling behavior back towards the narrative or by updating it to match the behavior. So, what does that mean? Most people try to change the narrative in the hope that the behavior will follow, right? The research really suggests that the reverse is at least as powerful. So when you change the behavior specifically and repeatedly, then the narrative follows. This doesn't mean forcing yourself to perform, in a false version. It just means choosing deliberately and with full awareness to act from the version of yourself that is true. Might not be habitual though, right? So the future self isn't a fantasy. It's more of an accurate version of who you already are. It just hasn't had enough time or repetitions yet to really run automatically. So how do we build this future self? What's the protocol? Because that's always what I get asked most. So how do I do it, Faye? You taught us about, what it means, but how do I do it? So there's really 4 steps, and this is a practice. Okay. So step 1, again, is get really specific, embarrassingly specific. Yes, we've talked about it before. And yes, you might have not really acknowledged it the same in April, but now that you've done all the work, you're looking at it a little differently. So most people's future self descriptions are really kind of aspirational mush. You know what I mean? I want to feel confident and successful and fulfilled. And the brain, I promise you, does not know what to do with that, right? What does that mean? It has no clue. So here's what specific looks like. What does the future self do for work? Not something meaningful in the reinvention space like what I do, but for exactly who, with exactly what outcome that you're trying to do, right? So how does the future self introduce themselves at a professional event? I want you to write the actual sentence, not more confidently than I do now. I want you to write the actual words, the actual sentence. What does the future self charge, for example? Not more. You don't want to tell the brain, oh, I'm going to charge more. I want the number, the rate, the structure, so that the brain understands, if you say, I charge $500 an hour and you say it out loud and you tell the brain, this is what I charge, then that's going to get cemented in. So what does the future self say no to the current version that says yes out of habits? So name it specifically, right? So maybe your future, you say, I will say no to any public speaking events that I'm not paid for, period. And so it becomes a habit, right? You just say no. Whereas before you might have said yes, because that was your habit. And maybe what does the future self say yes to that the current version hesitates on, right? And name that too. Because the more specific you go, the more the brain has to work with. So if you write it as a present tense description, not a I will be, but I'm more of an I am, That makes more sense. The brain doesn't know the difference between a vivid representation of the future state and an actual present tense experience. So that's what I want you to use. That's step number one. So be embarrassingly specific. Step number two, make it emotionally real, not just intellectually clear, right? The specificity is necessary. It's not sufficient to not be specific because the brain encodes things that are kind of emotionally significant. It encodes it more deeply and more durably than things that are interesting but kind of maybe emotionally flat, right? So you have to be able to feel the future self, not just describe it. This is where most people kind of get stuck because feeling something isn't really true. It feels more if you don't feel it, it feels more performative, right? It feels like you're pretending. It feels like you're constructing an emotion that isn't real. So here's a reframe for this. The emotion is the data that the brain uses to assess whether something matters. So if you describe the future self in like kind of flat, basic language, the brain files it as interesting, but it's low priority, probably won't happen. So let's just put it here in the dust corner. So if you describe the future self with genuine emotion and engagement, the actual feeling of what it would be like to actually inhabit that version, the brain flags it as this is important. This is emotionally significant. This is worth allotting resources to. The emotion isn't fake, it's the signal. And generating it deliberately is how you tell the brain this matters enough to build the pathway for it. So, where are we? Number one, you get specific. Number two, make it emotional. Number three, I want you to activate it repeatedly. And this is the part that nobody wants to hear. You don't do this once, you don't do it twice, you do it repeatedly across all these activation events. Like you want to keep doing it. So the pathways with that future self are starting to get stronger because it keeps seeing it over and over again. How many times? I know people ask me, how many times? More than probably you want it to be. And probably fewer than you're afraid it will take, right? In our Inner Circle 7-day challenge, we structured it to do this, but the broader practice is simpler than any formal challenge. So every morning before you start work or before you do anything else, take 3 minutes. That's it. Call up a future self-representation, and I want you to feel it. Then make the first decision of the day from that version rather than the automatic version of yourself. 3 minutes, that's it, every day. Do it for 1 month. 3 minutes for 1 month. Does you think you can make that happen? I mean, it's not asking a lot, but I want you to see what happens. And I'll tell you right now what happens before you even get there. Things start shifting in ways that are hard to attribute to anything specific because the change is distributed and the change is cumulative, right? And it's working and moving in the right direction. So that's number three. So you want to actually take your 3 minutes a day and just do it. And then finally, number four, you want to collect the evidence. So every time you act from that future self and it works, when the direct pitch lands, when the rate holds, when the room receives that present tense version of you, then I want you to write it down. One sentence. On Tuesday, I introduced myself as what I would do now rather than what I used to be. And the conversation went better. You're writing it down. You're reinforcing the case. You're building the case. It's a body of evidence that the future self is already operational in the world, right? So every piece of evidence that goes into that feedback loop, right? The brain uses to update. So the more evidence in that file, the faster the update. And it's not, this is not to self-congratulate yourself. It's just data collection because the brain needs evidence. How many times can I say that? Give it the evidence that you are moving in the right direction. Okay. So You have your protocol for the month, but let's talk a little bit about the specific mistake that people sometimes make. Let me name that thing that most people kind of get wrong because I've watched it happen enough times that I would consider it predictable, and this might happen to you. You know, they have a beautiful, specific, emotionally real future self description, right? And they activate it, they feel it, and they go into the room and they revert. The rate goes back down. The introduction goes back. The pitch gets downgraded, right? The present tense slides back into that old self. And they conclude this doesn't work for me. My old story is too strong, too established. Maybe I'll try it in the next decade. So, what's actually happening is the old pathways are exactly as strong as they were, and the new ones are exactly as young as they are. So, in high stakes moments, the brain defaults to those established paths because, hey, it's easier and we want to go into survival mode. But the response is that is this you have to make sure you need to keep going. So maybe you need one more activation event. Maybe you need one more time going into the room with the future self and seeing what happens. The old pathway is strong because it has 1,000 repetitions, right? The new one needs repetition too. You're not behind, you're early. So I want to say something specifically to anyone who at this point in this episode is thinking, this sounds like fake it till you make it. I hate fake it till you make it. It feels dishonest. And I hear you. And I want you to understand the distinction. Fake it till you make it says that you're pretending to be something you're not. And you hope nobody notices until you eventually become it. But what we're doing in this future self protocol, it's basically says you're acting deliberately from the version of yourself that is authentic. It's just not habitual yet. So you're giving the brain the behavioral evidence it needs to make the version your default. So it's not, this future self is not a fabrication. It's not you. It's not a lie. It is you. It's the version of you that April's work pointed towards, right? It's not a lie. You're performing, you're not performing. It's a truth that you're practicing. And there's a difference between those two. The difference between a practice that feels like you're wearing a costume and a practice that eventually feels like you're coming home. So here's what we're going to do in May. So you can do the early work with the destination mind, because it always really helps, right? So we're in week 1, and the week 1 is the future self protocol. That's today's episode. Follow along. You built the representation, right? You want to get it specific. You want to make it emotionally real. This week's assignment is to write that description, that full description, present tense. You know what you're supposed to do in terms of emotional, getting in there, feeling it, understanding it. In week 2, we're doing the 7-day future self activation within the inner circle and here. And basically, it's about one decision, one conversation, one action per day. We made it deliberately from the future self rather than the automatic self. Why? Because by day 7, you'll have an entire week of evidence, right? The case file starts. You're excited because you've got it building in. In week 3, in the inner circle, we build your second act bio. And we'll be doing that again on the podcast as well. And this is the external language of your new identity, how the future self describes themselves to the world, to on LinkedIn, in a speaker bio, in the first 30 seconds of a conversation, the words that signal the new chapter rather than the old one. And in week 3, in the inner circle, we do a veto workshop, and we're going to talk about it on the podcast as well. So we're going to veto the undersell, okay? The specific scripts that when somebody offers you less than your worth in money, in relationship, in family, in scope, in how they're describing what you do, the language for holding that line without apologizing or getting angry. So that's May. That's 4 weeks of installation after 4 weeks of really excavating that old self, right? So this week, again, you want to write the future self description, right? Actual writing, present tense, specific enough to be uncomfortable, and long enough to be real. So, what are we including in that? If you didn't catch it all the way through this, we want to make sure that you do what you do, who you do it for, what you charge, how you introduce yourself, what you say no to, what you say yes to, how the room feels when you walk into it as this new version of you. And I don't want you to hedge with I hope I am. It is I am. So for those of you in the inner circle, in our community, I want you to post it in the community threads if you're a member, right? Because the collective specificity of what people write in that thread every week is one of the most useful things you can do in our portal. Seeing your future self next to someone else's future self, it's cool. It changes something because you recognize that other people are doing the work for you. So the full Future Self Protocol Masterclass is in your inner circle portal right now. It's deeper and it's longer. It has exercises built in. And if you aren't part of our community, you can join toolatemayass.com/inner circle. Because remember, it's not too late. It has never been too late. Too late, my ass.
And that's a wrap on this one. If something landed for you today, sit with it. That's your nervous system updating its software. Let it run. And if you want to get deeper, the Long Game is our daily ritual app, 15 minutes a day, built around the move, mind, and meaning framework. It's the daily practice behind everything we talk about on this show. And you can find it at tlmalonggame.com. And if you're ready to be in the room, the inner circle is where we do the real work. Monthly masterclasses, identity challenges, and a community of people who are done playing small. Join us at toolatemayass.com/inner circle. Until next week, stay rebellious. I'll see you then.